On the 7th of May, 1945, a German Type 21 submarine, U-2513, surrendered at Horten in occupied Norway. Within a fortnight, she had been sailed under Royal Navy prize crew to Lissahalli on Lough Foyle, and by August, her schnorkel mast, her streamlined hull, and her astonishing submerged endurance were being stripped down and measured by naval constructors from Bath. What they found in that cold Ulster dockyard terrified them. The Type 21 could hold 18 knots beneath the surface for nearly 90 minutes and cruise silently on battery at 6 knots for 2 full days. The frigates and sloops that had broken donuts in the North Atlantic, the Flower-class corvettes, the Castle-class, the Captain-class destroyer escorts received under Lend-Lease could not catch her. They could not even hear her properly. The Admiralty's confidential report on the Type 21 circulated to the Director of Naval Construction. Sir Victor Shepherd, in January 1946, concluded bluntly that every escort vessel then in commission was obsolete against this class of submarine. That verdict was delivered into a political climate already hardening. Churchill had not yet given the Fulton speech, but the Chiefs of Staff Committee meeting of the 13th of March, 1946, catalogued by the Cabinet Office under reference CAB 79/46, identified the Soviet Union as the principal future adversary. Soviet naval intelligence indicated that the Russians had captured 4 complete Type 21 hulls at Danzig and Königsberg, along with the Deschimag yard drawings and a substantial quantity of the high-capacity batteries manufactured by Ackumulatoren Fabrik. By 1947, the first Whiskey-class boats were under construction at Gorky and Nikolaev, and naval attachés in Moscow were reporting a projected fleet of 300 submarines by 1965. The convoy routes to Murmansk, the Atlantic trade lanes on which Britain's food and oil still depended, the Mediterranean supply line to the Canal Zone, all of these faced a submarine threat of a scale and sophistication never previously encountered. The Royal Navy's immediate response was improvisation. 11 wartime destroyers of the R, T, U, and V classes were taken in hand for the limited conversion to Type 15 fast anti-submarine frigates, stripping them back to the upper deck and rebuilding them with a full-length superstructure and squid anti-submarine mortars. A further 10 received the cheaper Type 16 conversion. These were stopgaps. The ships were worn out, their hulls war-weary, their boilers approaching the end of economical life. Rear Admiral Louis Le Bailly, then a commander in the engineering branch, later recorded in his memoir that the conversions were understood at the time to be a holding action, buying perhaps a decade until a purpose-built design could be laid down. What was required was a frigate designed from the keel upwards to hunt the Type 21 and its Soviet derivatives. It would need the speed to overtake a submerged submarine making 18 knots. It would need the seakeeping to operate in the Iceland-Faroes Gap through a winter gale. It would need sonar capable of holding a contact at 3,000 yards through layer and wake, and weapons capable of killing a boat diving below 600 feet. Nothing in the world's navies in 1948 could do all of these things. The requirement for the ship that would become the Type 12 began to take shape inside the Admiralty that summer. The drawing offices at Foxhill on the southern edge of Bath had been the home of warship design since the evacuation from Whitehall in 1939. The constructors worked in a series of requisitioned villas on Bath's wooded hillside, and it was here, under the direction of the Assistant Director of Naval Construction for Frigates, that Staff Requirement 52 was translated into lines and specifications across the winter of 1948 and into the early months of 49. The Naval Staff Target, issued by the First Sea Lord's Office, Lord Fraser of North Cape, stipulated a first-rate ocean escort capable of 27 knots minimum sustained speed, a range of 4,500 nautical miles at 12 knots, and armament optimized specifically for anti-submarine warfare rather than the anti-aircraft role that had dominated wartime frigate design. The adversary was named explicitly in the staff papers. Soviet naval intelligence, collated from Bletchley Park's successor organizations at Eastcote and from the Norwegian Signals Intercept Station at Vadsø, had identified the Type 21 Soviet derivative, the Project 613 boat, as entering series production at the Krasnoye Sormovo yard at Gorky. Western naval staffs gave it the reporting name Whiskey. The boat was credited with a submerged speed of 13 knots, an operational diving depth of 170 meters, and a patrol endurance of 30 days. 236 examples would eventually be built. The Type 12 had to outthink and outfight a fleet of these boats in the North Atlantic, the Norwegian Sea, and the western approaches. The chief constructor assigned to the task was Arthur Honner, a man whose name would eventually be carried on the brass builder's plates of every Leander that slid down a slipway. Honner's team at Foxhill approached the problem by working backwards from the weapons. The Mark 10 Limbo mortar. Then, in advanced development at the Admiralty Underwater Weapons Establishment at Portland, required a clear arc astern and a stable platform in heavy seas. The Type 1-7. 4 medium-range search sonar demanded a dome beneath the forefoot that would not suffer from the aeration and slamming that had plagued wartime ASDIC installations in Atlantic weather. These two requirements, placed on opposite ends of the hull, dictated a great deal of what followed. The ship department drawings numbered in the catalogue as DNC 193-1 were circulated to the Controller of the Navy, Vice Admiral Sir Michael Denny, in June 1949. They showed a vessel of 369 feet overall length, 41 feet in the beam, and with a deep displacement of 2,560 tons. The sheer line was unusual. The forecastle rose sharply at the bow and swept back in a long, unbroken curve to a break abaft the funnel, giving the forward weather deck an exceptional height above the waterline. The stern was a transom, flat and deliberately short, permitting the Limbo to fire over it without interference. No British warship had previously been drawn with quite this profile. The preliminary design was examined at the Ship Model Experiment Works at Haslar in Gosport through the autumn of '49. The tank test confirmed what Honner's team had calculated. The hull form produced remarkably low resistance at high speeds and retained directional stability in following seas, a chronic weakness of wartime escorts. The controller approved the design for construction on the 22nd of November 1949, and the first order was placed with Camel Laird of Birkenhead for a ship to be named HMS Whitby. HMS Whitby was laid down on the 30th of September 1950 on number 4 slip at Camel Laird's Birkenhead Yard, the same slipway that had produced the battleship Prince of Wales a decade before. The hull that took shape over the following 14 months was unlike anything previously built for the Royal Navy. The most immediately visible feature was the forecastle, which rose 18 feet above the waterline at the stem and retained 14 feet of freeboard 3/4 of the way aft. The sheer was continuous, without the break that had disfigured every British escort hull since the Flower class. There was a reason for this, and it had been hammered out in the model tanks at Haslar through endless runs in artificial North Atlantic sea states. A conventional escort with a short forecastle and a long, low quarterdeck behaved badly in a head sea. green water broke over the forward deck, weapons froze, lookouts were swept from exposed positions, and speed had to be reduced to avoid structural damage to the superstructure. Wartime convoy commanders had complained bitterly about this throughout the Atlantic campaign, and their reports, preserved in the Naval Historical Branch files at the Admiralty, had been read carefully by Honnor's team. The Type 12's high, continuous forecastle kept the forward weapon dry in conditions that would have stopped a Black Swan-class sloop in its tracks. Trials conducted off Portland in 1957 in Force 9 conditions recorded the ship maintaining 22 knots into a head sea, while her escort of captain-class frigates had been reduced to 14. The transom stern was the second radical departure. British warships from the 1920s onwards had carried cruiser sterns, curved and graceful, which added several feet of length without adding waterline. The transom was brutally pragmatic. It saved weight, it saved construction time, and critically, it gave the limbo mortar mounted on the quarterdeck a clear firing arc astern. The flat cutoff also improved propulsive efficiency at high speeds by reducing stern wave-making resistance, a phenomenon that Froude's towing tank work at Hassler had mapped with precision. The combination of rising forecastle and cut transom gave the Type 12 her unmistakable profile, a silhouette that would be copied, with only minor variations, by 7 navies over the following 2 decades. Internal arrangements followed the same logic of purposeful design. The ship was built on the longitudinal framing system pioneered in the Daring-class destroyers, with transverse bulkheads dividing the hull into 14 watertight compartments. The machinery was arranged on the unit principle, with the forward boiler and forward engine room separated from their after counterparts by a watertight bulkhead and by the gearing compartment, so that a single torpedo hit could not disable all propulsion. This was a direct lesson from the loss of HMS Hood in 1941 and from the sinking of the destroyer Glowworm off Norway in 1940. The accommodation was to austere British standards, but considerably better than wartime escorts, with bunks replacing hammocks for the first time in a frigate hull, and a cafeteria-style messing arrangement borrowed from American practice. Whitby was launched by Lady Lambeth, wife of the Second Sea Lord, on the 2nd of July, 1954, with the yard band playing Hearts of Oak. The pennant number F36 was allocated. She completed sea trials off the Clyde in the summer of 1956 and commissioned into service on the 19th of July that year. Inside the hull of HMS Whitby sat a propulsion installation that represented the last and finest flowering of British marine steam engineering. 2 Babcock and Wilcox water tube boilers of the Admiralty 3-drum pattern raise steam at 550 pounds per square inch and 850 degrees Fahrenheit. These conditions, modest by contemporary American standards of 1,200 pounds, had been chosen deliberately after the troubled experience of the Daring class, whose higher pressure plant had proved maintenance intensive in fleet service. The Admiralty Engineer-in-Chief, Vice Admiral Sir Frank Mason, preferred a robust and forgiving plant that could be nursed by conscript national service stokers through a North Atlantic gale, rather than the thermodynamic optimum demanded by peacetime efficiency. Steam was delivered to 2 sets of English Electric double reduction geared turbines, one set driving each of the twin shafts. The total output was 30,000 shaft horsepower, 15,000 per shaft, sufficient to drive the 2,500-ton hull at a contract trial speed of 30.5 knots on the measured mile off the Isle of Arran. The actual figure achieved by HMS Torquay on the 6th of May, 1956, in Loch Fyne was 31.4 knots at deep displacement. a remarkable result for a ship designed primarily for seakeeping rather than dash speed. The Endurance at 12 knots, cruising on one boiler with the other banked, was 4,500 nautical miles, enough to take a Type 12 from Plymouth to the Caribbean station without bunkering. The arrangement of the machinery spaces reflected hard-won wartime experience. The forward boiler room, with its single Babcock unit, was separated from the after boiler room by the forward engine room, and the after engine room lay abaft the second boiler. This unit principle meant that a single hit amidships could not flood both boiler and engine room simultaneously. Each half of the plant could be cross-connected to either shaft through the gearing, allowing a crippled ship to limp home on one boiler and one engine. The funnel was a single large structure amidships, with the uptakes from both boiler rooms trunked into it, and it carried the radar lattice for the Type 977 air warning set at its summit. Electrical power came from 4 diesel generators of 200 kilowatts each, supplemented by 2 turbo alternators of similar rating. The total installed capacity of 1.2 megawatts was considered extravagant at the time of design, but was quickly absorbed by the escalating power demands of the sonar, radar, and electronic warfare fit over the ship's service life. The direct current system, running at 220 volts, was retained despite the Royal Navy's move towards alternating current in later designs, because the switchgear and generator sets were proven and the stockpile of spares was enormous. Fuel oil was carried in double-bottom tanks below the machinery spaces, 370 tons in total, with additional protective tanks outboard of the boiler rooms serving as liquid armor against underwater explosion. The fuel itself was furnace fuel oil, the heavy residual grade that the Admiralty had used since the 1920s, requiring preheating before it could be pumped to the burners. Replenishment at sea was accomplished by the astern method, with the tanker towing a hose down her wake to the frigate astern, a technique that the Royal Navy had pioneered during the Murmansk convoys and which remained standard practice in the home fleet until the mid-1960s. The weapon that defined the Type 12 and which justified the hull form and the propulsion plant that had been wrapped around it was the Mark 10 mortar, known universally in the service as Limbo. It sat on the quarterdeck, a squat 3-barreled installation weighing 36 tons, developed at the Admiralty Underwater Weapons Establishment at Portland under the direction of Captain Charles Goodeve's successors through the late 1940s. Limbo threw a 200-pound depth charge to a range of 1,000 yards ahead of the ship, or astern, with the barrels traversing through a full 360 degrees on their training base. The 3 bombs fell in a triangular pattern of approximately 40 yards side, and detonated at a depth set by the fire control computer from 0 to 1,000 feet. The killing radius of a single bomb against a Type 21 pressure hull was calculated at 20 feet. What made Limbo deadly was not the bomb, but the fire control. The Mark 10 was slave to the Type 170 attack sonar, a vertical fan transmitter operating at 15 kHz, mounted in a retractable dome beneath the ship's keel abaft the forward engine room. The 170 produced a narrow beam that was pointed at the target by the longer-range Type 174 search set housed in the forward dome. As the attacking frigate ran in, the 170 measured the target's depth by fan beam discrimination, a technique that no previous ASDIC had achieved, and fed depth, bearing and range directly to the flyplane computer in the operations room. The computer calculated the firing solution and trained and elevated the Limbo barrels automatically. The entire engagement, from initial contact to bomb water entry, could be completed in under 90 seconds. The forward armament was a twin 4.5-inch Mark 6 turret, the same mounting carried by the Daring-class destroyers and by the battle class conversions. The 4.5-inch was a dual-purpose weapon, throwing a 55-pound high-explosive shell to a maximum range of 20,000 yards at low elevation or to a ceiling of 40,000 feet at the full 80 degrees. Rate of fire was 24 rounds per gun per minute, sustained, fed from 2 magazines below the turret floor. Fire control was provided by the Mark VI Director mounted on the bridge roof with its associated Type II 7.5 gunnery radar. An installation directly evolved from wartime practice at HMS Excellent on Whale Island. Close-in anti-aircraft defence came from a single twin 40mm Bofors Mark V mounting abaft the funnel with stabilised tachymetric anti-aircraft gun sight control. The Bofors was an interim solution. The Admiralty recognised by 1955 that the 40mm gun was becoming marginal against jet aircraft. But the proposed replacement, the 70mm water-cooled weapon under development at Vickers, was cancelled in 1958 on cost grounds, and the Bofors soldiered on into the 1970s. Torpedo armament was 2 twin launchers for the Mark XX anti-submarine torpedo, an electrically propelled homing weapon of 21-inch diameter. The Mark XX was a passive acoustic homer, developed at the Anti-Submarine Experimental Establishment at Fairley on the Clyde, and gave the Type 12 a standoff killing capability against a submerged target beyond Limbo's 1,000-yard reach. The combination of long-range search by the 174, classification and attack by the 170, standoff engagement by the Mark XX torpedo, and close-in kill by the Limbo made the Type 12 the most formidable submarine killer afloat in the 1950s. HMS Whitby commissioned at Birkenhead on the 19th of July, 1956, under the command of Captain Hugh Martell. She sailed south to Portland for workup with the Flag Officer Sea Training, Rear Admiral Sir Charles Madden, whose staff subjected every new frigate to the 6-week ordeal known throughout the fleet simply as Portland. The assessment report, filed in the Admiralty records under reference ADM 1/27349, concluded that the new class represented a qualitative advance over every previous escort design and recommended immediate expansion of the building program. A further 5 Whitby-class ships followed from Camel, Laird, Thornycroft, Harland and Wolfe, Stevens, and Yarrow, named Torquay, Scarborough, Tenby, Eastbourne, and Blackpool, all commissioned between 1957 and 1958. The operational deployment pattern was dictated by the geography of the Soviet submarine threat. 4 of the 6 Whitby class went to the 2nd Frigate Squadron at Londonderry, where they worked the Iceland-Faroes United Kingdom gap, alongside the Maritime Patrol, Shackletons of Coastal Command, operating from Ballykelly. The other 2 joined the 6th Frigate Squadron at Portland, tasked with training and with Channel patrol work. HMS Torquay's logs for the winter deployment of 1958, held at the National Archives at Kew under ADM 53, record a patrol in the Denmark Strait, during which she held sonar contact on a submerged Soviet Whiskey-class boat for 11 hours in Force 8 conditions, an achievement that no previous British escort could have approached. The success of the Whitby class prompted an immediate follow-on order. The Rothesay class, formerly designated the improved Type 12, was authorised under the 1956 estimates. 9 ships were ordered, named Rothesay, Londonderry, Brighton, Falmouth, Yarmouth, Rhyl, Lowestoft, Plymouth, and Berwick. The improvements over the Whitby class were incremental but significant. The quarterdeck was modified to accept a single limbo mounting, the deleted second mortar's weight and space being reserved for a helicopter flight deck and hangar, initially for the Westland Wasp anti-submarine helicopter, which entered service in 1963. The addition of the helicopter transformed the ship's reach. A Wasp with two Mark 44 homing torpedoes could prosecute a contact at ranges up to 20 miles from the parent ship, far beyond the reach of any shipboard weapon. The Rothesay class also introduced the Seacat surface-to-air missile, replacing the twin Bofors mount abaft the funnel. Seacat, developed at Short Brothers and Harland in Belfast, was the world's first operational shipboard point defence missile system and entered service in 1962. The missile was command-guided by optical or radar tracking, carried a warhead of 39 pounds, and had a slant range of 3 miles. It was a modest weapon by later standards, effective against subsonic aircraft, but marginal against supersonic attackers. Yet it gave the Type 12 its first genuine defense against the Soviet Ilyushin 28 jet bomber that was by then deploying to airfields in Murmansk Oblast. The combined Whitby and Rothesay classes, 15 hulls in total, formed the backbone of Royal Navy escort strength through the 1960s. They operated from the Shetlands to Singapore, from the Beira Patrol off Mozambique, enforcing the Rhodesian oil embargo, to the Cod Wars off Iceland, where HMS Scarborough was rammed by the Icelandic gunboat Thor in May 1973. They proved the honor design in every sea condition the world could offer. By 1960, the Type 12 had become, without exaggeration, the most sought-after frigate design outside the Soviet bloc. The export story began in Canberra. The Royal Australian Navy's post-war escort force rested on wartime River-class frigates and Tribal-class destroyers, all of them approaching block obsolescence by the mid-1950s. The Australian Naval Board, under the chairmanship of Vice Admiral Sir Roy Dowling, reviewed the available designs in 1955 and approved the Type 12 without serious competition. 6 ships were built to an Australianised standard, designated the River class in Commonwealth service at Cockatoo Island Dockyard in Sydney and at Williamstown in Victoria. HMAS Parramatta, Yarra, Stuart, Derwent, Swan, and Torrens carried modifications suited to tropical operations, including improved ventilation, a helicopter flight deck on the later 4 ships, and Ikara anti-submarine missile launchers in place of the forward limbo. The last of them, Torrens, commissioned as late as January 1971. New Zealand took 2 hulls, Otago and Taranaki, built at Thornycroft and at Scots of Greenock respectively, and commissioned in 1960 and 1961. The Royal New Zealand Navy operated them on the Far East Station and on South Pacific Patrol, with minor variations in electronics to reflect Wellington's closer integration with the United States ANZUS command structure. The ships were otherwise nearly identical to British Rothesay class units. India was the third customer. The Indian Navy, still heavily anglicised in training and doctrine in the late 1950s, ordered 3 Whitby-class ships from British yards to be named Talwar, Trishul, and Kukri. All 3 were built at Camel Laird and at John Brown's on the Clyde and commissioned between 1958 and 1960. A further 6 hulls of an improved Indian variant, designated the Nilgiri class, were built under license at Mazagon Dock in Bombay between 1972 and 1981, with progressively more indigenous content in the later ships. This marked the first transfer of a complete British warship design to South Asian industrial construction. South Africa received 3 Rothesay-class variants, named President Kruger, President Stein, and President Pretorius. Built at Yarrow on the Clyde and at Alexander Stevens at Linthouse, they entered Simonstown service between 1962 and 1964. They carried French Alouette helicopters in place of the Wasp, a consequence of the British arms embargo that followed the Sharpeville shootings, and they operated the only Rothesay-derived ships to be lost in peacetime. President Kruger sank after a collision with the tanker SAS Tafelberg off the Cape on the 18th of February 1982, with the loss of 16 lives. The more surprising customers were the smaller variants. The Netherlands studied the Type 12 closely before opting for their own Van Spijk class, 6 hulls built at Royal Schelde and at Nederlandse Dock, to near identical Type 12 lines but with Dutch electronics and machinery. These were, in all but name, licensed Rothesays. Brazil ordered 6 ships of the Niterói class from Vosper Thornycroft in 1970, built at Woolston and at Rio de Janeiro, the design being a lengthened and diesel plus gas turbine variant of the Type 12 hull form. The 7th nation, and perhaps the least expected, was Chile. The Chilean Navy took 2 ex-Royal Navy Rothesay class ships, Lowestoft and Londonderry, on transfer in the late 1980s, renaming them Baquedano and Condell for patrol duties in the South Pacific. The geographical reach of the design, from the Humber to the Hooghly, from Valparaiso to Valletta, was unprecedented for any post-war frigate. No single British hull form was copied, licensed, or transferred to more navies in the Cold War era. The Type 12's most significant descendant never bore the Type 12 name. In 1959, the Ship Department at Bath, again under Arthur Honner's direction, began work on a general-purpose frigate that would carry the same hull form, the same machinery layout, and broadly the same anti-submarine suite, but with a full helicopter hangar, a longer-range air warning radar, and a modified superstructure optimized for command and control. The requirement was numbered Staff Target 194, and the result was the Leander class, the most successful Royal Navy surface warship of the entire Cold War. 26 Leander class ships were built between 1963 and 1973. The hull beneath them, with only minor modifications to the bow sections and a slightly widened beam on the Batch 3 broad-beam ships, was directly lineal from HMS Whitby. The Leander bloodline fought the Royal Navy's last great naval campaign. When Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands on the 2nd of April 1982, the task force assembled under Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward included 6 Leander-class frigates and 2 surviving Rothesay-class ships, HMS Plymouth and HMS Yarmouth. Plymouth, launched at Devonport in 1959 under the Rothesay program, found herself on the 25th of April 1982, closing the coast of South Georgia in company with the County-class destroyer Antrim. Her Wasp helicopters, flying in appalling weather from the Rothesay flight deck that had been added nearly 2 decades earlier, attacked and disabled the Argentine submarine Santa Fe with AS-12 missiles in Grytviken Harbour. It was the first successful anti-submarine action by a Royal Navy surface vessel since 1945, executed by a ship whose design had been drawn specifically to hunt Soviet submarines of that same generation. Plymouth went on to serve through the main Falklands campaign, firing her 4.5-inch guns in the bombardment of Argentine positions around Port Stanley, taking 4 bomb hits from Argentine A-4 Skyhawks in Falkland Sound on the 8th of June, 1982, and surviving to sail home to a hero's welcome at Rosyth. Yarmouth, her sister, escorted the stricken HMS Sheffield after the Exocet strike on the 4th of May, and later took off survivors from HMS Coventry. The Leander-class ships, Andromeda, Argonaut, Minerva, Penelope, and the others in the task force proved the honor hull form one final time in the South Atlantic swells. The class was withdrawn from Royal Navy service through the 1980s and into the early 1990s. The last British Rothesay, HMS Berwick, paid off in 1986. The last Leander, HMS Andromeda, decommissioned in 1993. Several found second careers in foreign service. HMS Rill ended her days as a target hulk, sunk by the submarine HMS Splendid off the west coast of Scotland on the 14th of April 1985 in a demonstration firing of the Tigerfish Mark 24 torpedo. It was a fitting end. The ship that had been designed to hunt Soviet submarines was killed by a British one in her own home waters. The archival record of the Type 12 program rests now in the Brass Foundry at Woolwich, where the original builder's half models are preserved, and in the National Archives at Kew, where Honnor's design notebooks and the Admiralty correspondence survive in the ADM 1 and ADM 167 series. The ships themselves are gone. The shape of them, that high forecastle and flat transom, remains the most influential frigate silhouette of the post-war era. Drawn and redrawn in 7 navies for nearly 50 years,